I just had a really engaging half an hour with Chris. I want to call him Feliciano, which is a good Brazilian last name. And Chris is Brazilian. He lived there all of 6 weeks. Is that right?
Yeah, that's about right. 6 weeks, really fun. 6 weeks, first 6 weeks of life, actually.
Yeah, right.
From what I gather, I was hungry.
Yeah. So anyway, we just had a really engaging, because our lives have had incredible intersections with respect to experiences, but spaced about 45 years apart, which is also very interesting. Chris's book, The Third Bank of the River, is really well researched, really engaging, and I learned more about the Amazon. I actually, Mary and my wife who was here, and I lived in the Amazon for about a year, 50 years ago. And it was a very different place then. Manaus, for example, is today a city of 2.5 million people. And if you divide that by 10, it was about 250,000 when we were there for a period of time. And if you read the book, you learn the history and the fact that it was, a little 15,000 until the rubber boom. But why don't you tell us why it's the third bank?
Yeah, so on my first trip to Brazil in 2006, I was sort of enchanted by the country. And at the time in 2006, there was a now defunct airline called Varig Airlines that offered a Brazil pass that allowed you to sort of have an open-ended 5-stop itinerary throughout Brazil. And so among my 5 stops, I chose Manaus as one of my stops. And while I was on my first stop on that journey, a Australian traveler, who's one of those Australians who was just traveling for like 2 years at a time, he encouraged me to drop the Sao Paulo section of my itinerary and just spend more time on the Amazon. And so I followed that advice. It seemed like good advice, grounded in experience. And so instead of just passing through Manaus, I spent about a week taking a long, slow boat from Manaus to Belém and just sort of taking in the river firsthand. And there's not a lot to do on those boats sometimes, but read. And one of those trips, or one of those long days of reading, I encountered the marvelous Brazilian short story, A Terceira Margem do Rio, The Third Bank of the River, by João Guimarães Rosa. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, it's just a wonderful, marvelous, fabulous story that takes place not in the Amazon, but takes place on a river, and very much deals with questions of life and death and mortality. And if we know there's a left bank and we know there's a right bank, what if there's a third bank? And so something about that title struck me, and that story struck a chord with how I felt on the river. A sort of sense of timelessness, and a life on the Amazon really puts your sense of time and history and your scale in a different perspective. And so I decided to borrow that title for my book. And if nothing else, if this book introduces readers to that original short story, I'll consider it a success in some regard. So
yeah, I'm going to have to run out and get it. Obviously, I don't know the other thing I really liked was I mentioned how well researched it is, but it's also, I think, indicative in your style that you have a sense of, you are a creative writer. You have a novel or two, and the way you actually present the story, not of Brazil, but basically of the Amazon over the last 1,000 years, in a way that you kept me on the edge of my seat. Say, where's he going now? Why? What's going on? In fact, when you introduce one of the main parts, which is a horrendous 24, 36 hours worth of killings in the city of Manaus, I couldn't tell what was going on, which was exactly what you wanted, I think.
Yeah, it's for me, I think one of the projects of this book was to sort of expand readers' sense of imagination about the Amazon, in that before I had visited the Amazon, I really had not much to go on except for like movies that I saw in the 80s, right? So like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and so forth, or not the Temple of Doom, but the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The idea that the Amazon is this sort of this impenetrable, dangerous place, and the Green Inferno, as the first colonists and settlers used to describe it as. And it wasn't until I visited the Amazon that I realized, and this was my first trip there was in 2006, what a dynamic and multifaceted place it is, how much more it is than a jungle. And in fact, in writing this book, I kind of went out of my way not to use the word jungle at all and really think about it as a forest, which seems like such a more of a living thing. And so I think one of the things that I wanted to do in terms of telling the story was give a sense of the Amazon that is more expansive of that it's one of those regions of the world that everyone knows by name and that everyone has a strong myth in their minds about the Amazon, but I wanted to introduce people to what the Amazon is like in the 21st century, a place that's very dynamic, that's full not just of tribes in the deep interior, but also street gangs and the accompanying street violence in urban Manaus, for example. So I think for me, to the extent I was able to keep you on the edge of your seat, and I appreciate that, it's in hopes that I could tell a story that introduces people to some new dynamics of that region.
Yeah, there are several areas that I learned a lot. One was the question. I mean, whenever anyone goes to Brazil, one of the things that you're always told is, watch your wallet. Don't walk around with your fancy watches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we went for 50 years going to Brazil, knowing that and being careful. And then the last time we were in Brazil, we were actually held up for the first time, which was very sobering. But there is the other sense of the river that I think comes through very well in your book. And we used to say that the river's Amazon, or the Amazons, because in fact you're very good at keeping to the correct terminology. The Amazon actually only starts at Manaus, when the Rio Negro, the Black River, meets the Solimões, which I've never figured out why it's the Solomons. But when those two rivers come together, it's the Amazon. And in some respects, I've told people, if you really want to see wildlife, you really don't go to the Amazon, because it's like being on the freeway.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that when we think about the Amazon of our imagination, oftentimes people will travel to the Amazon, and I went there myself expecting this sort of HD, 4K, high-definition experience of wildlife in the Amazon, right? Yet, so much of how we experience the rainforest here in the United States is through this highly mediated experience of television, where everything is through these sort of like ultra close zoom lenses. And when you actually see the forest itself, you realize there's actually not a whole lot to see, unless you're exceedingly quiet and camouflaging yourself. And so for me, I think one of the challenges was to try to break open people's preconceptions about the Amazon. And it's interesting that you mentioned like being held up in Brazil. Where, if you don't mind sharing, where were you in that?
In the Pantanal, the only time anyone's ever been held up in the Pantanal.
Okay, so one thing, as I was writing this book, there is a good third of this book, if not more, that deals with some of the social ills that people are very familiar with in terms of Brazil, in terms of drug trafficking, in terms of street violence, homicide, corruption among the police, and so forth. And in terms of representing this country and knowing that this book was going to be an act of representation, and being from Brazil myself, having family, people I love who live there, one of the things I was cognizant of and tried to be cautious about was, how am I going to represent this country in a way that does not reinforce some of the worst and most negative stereotypes about Brazil? However, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that in the global imagination, the country of Brazil, which is enormous, is almost like an island, roughly the shape of Rio de Janeiro. And most people don't really give much thought to Brazil beyond the boundaries of its southernmost cities and the attendant social problems there. So to the extent that I feel like I'm covering somewhat negative ground in terms of describing drug-related violence and organized crime and so forth, I do feel like there's value in communicating that these social ills extend to the entirety of Brazil, and that there are actually megacities in the Amazon, and that all of those same issues that are social ills in Rio and Sao Paulo are also very serious problems that deserve our attention in cities like Manaus or Belém as well.
So one of the things that we'll talk a little bit later about is the questions of development, but you show you have a point in here where you are actually on what's called the Trans-Amazon Highway. And I shared with Chris that Mary and I were actually in the northeast Brazil when the Minister of Transportation of Brazil in 1971 decided to inaugurate the Trans-Amazon that started in northeastern Brazil and was designed to go all the way to Peru. And it's actually made it about halfway through the Amazon, right? Yeah. And you actually were on for 12 or more hours on a bus there, or longer?
So I took a bus from the city of Santarém, which is a port city there on the river that has turned into one of the largest ports for soy and other agricultural products coming out of the Amazon up over to the Atlantic. I took a bus from there to the city of Altamira, which is the hub of the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam project. And so I was on a bus headed south for a good 3 or 4 hours, and then headed east on the Transamazonica. And I imagine it is probably in far worse shape now than it was when it was first erected, because it's kind of a bumpy ride. But one of the things that was startling to me was that, to the extent that we were in the middle of nowhere, I was also on a bus that was, equipped with Wi-Fi and had college students on it with their MacBooks and so forth, working on their homework. And so, at the same time that I'm looking out the window at times on this bus ride and looking at landscape that had been, at times in primary forests that had been untouched for millennia, at other times looking at forests that had been leveled into cattle pasture, and then I'm also looking at college kids who could be, any college kid on the Muni here in San Francisco, kind of working on their homework on their laptop. So for me, it was that dynamic of this swirling together of eras and human experiences that was one of the things that kept me coming back. I'm curious if you could tell me, what was that what do you remember of that inauguration? I have a vision in my mind. I'd love to hear from you about it.
So it was in the town of Souza, Paraíba. And Souza, in my sort of panoply of memories, was sort of a bigger city in the Sertão, which is the dry, arid part of the state of Paraíba. Paraíba is right at the bulge of the northeast of Brazil. So it's the part that's actually closest to Africa. It's very dry out there, and so this was in the middle of the dry season, and it was the sort of thing where probably 500 people came from Brasilia to put up big, swaths of banners. Wow. And, they actually cut the banner, and Mario Andreasa, who was this bigger-than-life person in those days, who everyone thought might be a potential presidential candidate someday, was the Minister of Transport. And wow. And it was a great party, basically.
And I imagine a source of great pride.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that it started there in the little town of Souza, Paraíba,
Yeah, it's interesting that even now, I was looking at some data that was some survey data that was just released today. That's a survey of about 1,000 Brazilians from earlier this month, so like roughly August 12th through August 16th. It says that some 90% of Brazilians surveyed, including Bolsonaro voters, still identify the Amazon as a major source of national pride. Yeah. And so many of those military endeavors of the 60s and 70s, in those efforts to integrate, they had all sorts of interesting euphemisms for what they wanted to do in the Amazon, but their efforts to integrate the Amazon and bring it into the fold of the rest of the country, those stories that Brazil has told itself about the Amazon resonate to this day with people in ways that are both positive and negative. But I'm struck by that sense of pride in the Amazon that I saw everywhere I traveled, and that resonates now in Brazil, even in its southern cities, and how much that pride and sort of sense of national patrimony is at odds with what we see happening there.
O Amazonas é nosso. It's ours.
Exactly.
If you'll indulge me for a second, there are two passages that really struck me in the book, and this one is, The bus rumbles on, passengers awake on a nighttime journey through the Transamazonica, the Transmiseria. Pale blue faces staring into their phone screens, craving the ping of the next cell tower. The driver double-checking his scheduled maintenance, old bones creaking to the next one hotel town. Ruropolis, Uruara, Medicilandia, loved ones waiting for loved ones under red neon lights, a country of perpetual waiting, waiting for a cattle run, waiting for fire season, waiting to strike gold, waiting on a passerby to help push her combi from the muck, waiting for sun, waiting for rain, waiting for the soil to admit its mistakes, waiting for the question, waiting for the answer, waiting for Friday night when the only new horizon is straight out of town, gunning your moto, vapor in the gas tank, a phantom in the headlight, the spirit of a chief still awestruck by the white man who commands his rancorous yellow beasts with a wave of the hand. And Mary asked me what I thought the yellow beasts were, and I said, probably Caterpillar tractors.
Exactly. Okay, whew, that was clear enough without me calling out the brand name. Oh, thank you for reading that, though. It's I still, when I close my eyes, can see so many of those little one hotel towns there along the Transamazonica. Many of those towns remain to this day what I imagine they were pretty much in the days that they were first settled, which is places of not a lot of economic opportunity for the people who live there. Yet now there's this convergence of technology that has brought the outside world to some of the most remote places on Earth. This is where I have some visual aids that I love to share with the audience. So when I first visited Brazil, and when I first visited the Amazon in 2006, this was the primary mode of getting information. There's like a little pocket radio. So when I was on the boat, I would just like turn on this antenna and just, scan, hope you get an AM channel and get some news of the day, right? What's happening on the river. Maybe you get some sports scores and so forth. When I returned to Brazil to cover the FIFA World Cup in 2014, I was using this sort of like knockoff BlackBerry device. So I could text, I could email, but I couldn't like get images or anything really. I don't even think this battery runs anymore. But by the time that I was there in 2016 to cover the Olympics, I was using the good old iPhone 5 of the time, and I wasn't the only one. By 2016, there were moments in Manaus when it was like indistinguishable from here in San Francisco, where you see people like bumping into each other because they're busy posting to Instagram. And for me, it was astonishing to see the movement from this to Instagram in less than a decade. And when we think about the level of opportunity that brings, but also the level of inequity and social strain that brings, that's one of the things that's just it continues to astonish me every time I go back. And one of the things that kept bringing me back to the region to look for more of these schisms, so to speak. And so that passage that you read, and thank you for reading it, for me, really captures how the Amazon as a region is really one of the places on Earth where you can see multiple eras of the human experience existing at the same time.
You're also very good at describing the hydrology. People, I think, who've never been to see high water versus low water have no idea the extremes. Could you explain the extremes of levels of water in the Amazon?
So when I pitched this book on proposal, I didn't quite. I was certainly out of my depth because this was before all my research and before a lot of my traveling. To the point where when I originally pitched the idea, I wanted to talk about how different the Amazon is during its high water season, during its low water season. And so I remember talking to some people at my publisher and trying to wow them with the dramatic differences. About 3 years into writing the book, I came to understand that there is no single high water and low water season in the Amazon because the Amazon is so big that the water is always high somewhere and it's always low somewhere. So for me, it's one of those things that that's just one example of how the Amazon of my imagination was sort of transformed and complicated by my experience actually being there. And to your point of dramatic differences in water levels, During high water season in Manaus, there are entire regions of the city where you're looking out across a body of water with boats, riverboats floating on that water, and you can come to the exact same spot 3 or 4 months later and see you're looking out across just a barren, dry floodplain, and those boats are just, tipped askew there on dry land. And people are still living in the boats. People are still using the boats. They're just waiting
They're
for
40
the
and
boats.
50 feet below you.
Yeah, and then you're waiting. They're just kind of waiting for the water to come back and lift them up. So it's really astonishing, both in the cities and elsewhere, the difference in the water levels, but also how much that, as astonishing as it may be to an outsider like me, how much that's just completely the way of life for the people who call the river home, particularly the indigenous communities and the boatsmen and women among those communities who hold in their minds two completely different maps of the region in which they live, high water and low water, and it may change for them how they get from point A to point B. There's a way you go in the high season and a way you go in the low season.
So my memory is Manaus is about 1,500 miles from the ocean. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And there is a tidal effect there of a foot or two. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And think about that for a second. How that can happen.
And at Belém, at the other end near the mouth, there's a surfing competition there as well.
Right, the Pororoca. Yeah. Pororoca is a tidal bore that occurs in the equinoxes. Yes, in the equinoxes usually, September and March, and you can actually surf for an hour if you catch the right wave. Yeah, and you can look at that on YouTube. Yeah. So the size and the amount of water is always just absolutely astounding to me. And what is it? 1/3 of the fresh water to our oceans comes from the Amazon.
Yeah, and speaking of oceans, oftentimes when people think about the different ecosystems that we ought to be alarmed about in terms of global climate, we think about glaciers and we think about the oceans and then we think about the rainforest. But it's also important to remember there's essentially an ocean above the rainforest. That's how much water there is in its atmosphere. And so it's really this incredible convergence of natural phenomena that, of course, we all very much rely on for the stability of our climate. But as you mentioned size and scale, one thing that I always try to stress to people as well is the scale of the human landscape of the Amazon. So if you think about the greater Amazon basin, there are 30 million people living in the greater Amazon basin. So just to put that in context, we're talking about more people than in Texas, more people than in New York State, more people than in the state of Florida, more people than in, I hope I get this right, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland combined are living in the greater Amazon basin. And if we think about the Amazon of many people's imagination, including Jair Bolsonaro, for example, the Amazon is this sort of sparsely populated region, mostly full of indigenous people. But what I can tell you from firsthand experience is that there are many Chinese immigrants there. There are many Haitian immigrants there. There are many Venezuelan immigrants there. There are immigrants from all over Brazil and across the world, especially in cities like Manaus and Belém, who've come there for its economic opportunity. And so I think as we try to complicate and challenge ourselves in how we think about the Amazon, I think all of these natural phenomena and the enormity and scale of those is really important, but we also have to think about it too in terms of its human landscape, which is enormous.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the violence in the cities, but another striking area that you go into, I think, in great depth is the question of uncontacted tribes. And as a setup to that, I want to mention that if you haven't read yet Andrea Wolf's book called The Invention of Nature, which is the story of Alexander Humboldt. And about the first quarter of the book deals with a 2-year trip that he took in the Amazon. In fact, he was the first guy to go from Venezuela through the jungles there to the Orinoco, through what's called the Casiacari, and down the Rio Negro. But anyway, he saw a lot of uncontacted Indians then. But give us a little bit of a sense of how things have changed with respect and the various things that people think about in terms of what are we doing with uncontracted tribes?
Yeah, so I think one distinction that I think is important to bear in mind is, for the most part, in the vast majority of cases, when we're talking about so-called uncontacted tribes, we're actually talking about isolated tribes. And that these tribes, in fact, have had contact at one point in history with the outside world, and they are isolating themselves precisely because they had that contact, which was, for the most part, pretty awful. And so when we think about these isolated tribes, of which there are hundreds in the greater Amazon basin, the majority of which are in Brazil, they're living in voluntary isolation because their ancestors and forebears have had oftentimes violent, horrific contact with outsiders, and even in the contemporary times, horrific contact with illegal miners, wildcat miners, illegal loggers, drug traffickers, and so forth. And so to the extent that we think about isolated tribes in the Amazon, one thing that makes this particular moment for the Amazon so distressing is that the environmental pressures being put on these remote natural conservation areas and indigenous reserves are such that these isolated tribes are essentially bumping into each other in some cases, and oftentimes finding less and less space to seek refuge. And so even if the fires that you may see burning on the edge of the state of Acre and so forth are not necessarily always burning like primary rainforest, what they are doing is bringing the frontier ever closer and ever closer to those isolated tribes and giving them fewer and fewer places to seek refuge. So even if you don't see a fire that is causing a tribe, although there are plenty of fires that are causing great harm to tribes, even if you don't see a fire in the rainforest that's encroaching upon an isolated village, rest assured it's having ripple effects in the deeper interior of the forest, not to mention the ecological harm and environmental harm.
Chris, explain a little bit about the health concerns of an uncontacted tribe.
So one of the stories that I trace in this book that opens the book is an event that took place actually during the FIFA World Cup in Manaus. While the world spotlight was on Manaus and all the matches taking place there, in the state of Acre, on the border of Brazil and Peru, there was an isolated tribe that came into contact with a settled tribe there on the border. A settled tribe being one that has some contact with the government, has general, participates in the civic life of Brazil. They have a school, they have government representation and so forth, but they aren't necessarily, they're also 7 days from the nearest road, right? So that's what I mean by a settled tribe. This tribe came into contact with an isolated tribe that had been essentially fleeing from marauders, illegal traffickers and loggers who'd essentially ransacked their village. So this isolated tribe came into contact with the settled tribe. Well, oftentimes these isolated tribes have been isolated for so long that something as simple as a common cold or flu can be potentially lethal to their entire tribal community. Unfortunately, when they come into these settled villages, they're often fascinated by some of the contemporary modern objects that they see, such as T-shirts, for example. Something as everyday as a T-shirt. So one of the things that caused great alarm among the health officials that were following this case was that this isolated tribe had brought one of those T-shirts back to their village. And one of the things that often happens is that that shirt then gets passed around because everybody wants to try it on. Well, if that T-shirt is carrying a disease agent, it could potentially be lethal to that entire isolated tribe. And so the story that I traced at the beginning of the book is about a doctor who specializes in indigenous medicine who brought his team to the border to essentially try to manage the situation and mitigate any further harm. But I think it goes to show just what precarious situations these isolated tribes are in, and how even the most seemingly innocuous contact, such as receiving a shirt or some other gift from a settled tribe, can potentially have grave consequences.
I love history, and I was really pleased with how well you document the flow of history in the Amazon, starting with how early Manaus was founded, when rubber was discovered and had a use, and how it changed the face of the Amazon. In fact, all of the Amazon basin. And you mentioned one of my heroes that I'd not heard about until I read a book by Mario Vargas Llosa, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning, no, not Pulitzer, excuse me, Nobel Prize winning novelist from Peru. And I don't remember the name of it, but it tells a story of Roger Casement and his whole life, which includes, I think, a year being sent to study the case of abuse of Indians in the Amazon associated with rubber. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the term crimes against humanity, which gets bandied about a lot in the 21st century, actually originated as a descriptor of the horrors of the rubber boom in the Amazon region. That's how brutally indigenous labor, men, women, and children were being used in the service of a quota system for rubber tappers that was absolutely horrific, and also taking place largely outside of the view of any outside observers, or of course the media of the time was slow to respond. But yeah, it's probably one of the darker chapters of world history, if certainly Brazilian history and the history of the Amazon. But it's definitely shocking, and there's been several. I'll have to check out was this a novel that you'll?
Yeah, it was a novel.
I'll
Well,
have to check
no,
that
it's a
out.
historical novel. So
historical.
it really puts flesh and bones on
Yeah,
this
yeah, I'll have to check
incredible Irish character
Yeah.
who starts out as being the British consul general in some part of the Congo, who explodes all of the fantasies of how good the Belgian Congo was, and then because of his work exposing what's the atrocities there, he gets sent to Peru to do the same thing there.
And without getting into too much of the details that you can delve into in the book, I mean, we're talking about things like matters of coercion, such as progressive amputation to encourage workers to meet their quotas, and that's just skimming the surface of what these rubber barons were doing at the time. And so it's really just one of a history and a cycle of dark chapters of exploitation in the Amazon.
And before we go on to current policies, politics, and perspectives, will you indulge me? I'd like to read one other area in your book,
Absolutely.
which
Thank you.
is about the river. I retreated to the rear deck. Oh, before I ask, so we took the fastest boat possible from Manaus to the town of Tefe, which is halfway from Manaus to the Colombian-Peruvian border. That took us 4.5 days. How fast was your fast boat going to the border?
It was fast. It was like, imagine a jet on the water. Like it's a giant jet boat that's essentially, we went from Manaus to Tabatinga. I believe the trip was 36 hours.
Okay.
So we were flying. Yeah. And but don't get me wrong, it's a surprisingly comfortable ride too. Movies, dinners, it's much like flying in a plane. I mean, it was like a commercial, almost like a commercial airline on the water. Like you sit
You
down,
made
have
me
your
not
tray
want to go out on
table.
the back deck because of the fumes.
Yeah,
huh?
the back deck though, there's some pretty serious diesel fumes there on the back deck. But if you stay in the comfortable cabin, it's a pretty sweet ride.
So here's Chris talking. I retreated to the rear deck, Brazilian flag fluttering overhead. To sleep would be a waste to waste these quiet hours on the river. We passed pulsing cell towers, lonely houses on stilts bathed in floodlight, constellations of Christmas bulbs through the trees, the gift of light from Lula, a miracle, even if it may have cost the young democracy its soul. Between villages, the shore was perfectly black, the wavering silhouette of the canopy against a spectral sky. Snaking upriver, the curves on their route were so elongated that the only way to perceive our change in course was to track the planets on the low horizon, drifting left, right, left again on the cosmic plane. Very nicely written.
Thank
I
you.
really like
Thank
that
you.
piece. So as advertised, last November, Bolsonaro, right, Jair Bolsonaro won the second round of elections, beating the stand-in Workers' Party candidate, Haddad, wasn't it?
Yes.
And
Standing in, just to call out for those who aren't familiar, standing in for former President Lula, who was barred from running for re-election because he was in prison at the time, following an investigation that grows increasingly dubious the more we learn about it.
Okay.
Yeah, just to, in terms of the stand, just to call out the, in terms of the stand, who Haddad was standing in for, I think we ought to.
Yeah. So, again, the other historical perspective, I think many of you, how many people here have been in Brazil? Okay. I don't have to go belabor anything about Brazilian politics then. Tell us about the Amazon and Bolsonaro. What do you think's happening?
What I think is happening is, so we were talking earlier as we had a chance to chat about your experience in Brazil and in the Amazon in the 60s and in the 70s. And it was fascinating to get to speak with somebody who was there witnessing firsthand things that I was only able to research through books. What I think is that on many levels in terms of his vision for Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro is intent on turning back the clock to manifest a Brazil that echoes the priorities and policies and vision of the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 68 to, from 64 to 88. And insofar as that's playing out in the Amazon right now, the way it seems to be playing out is a almost relentless rollback of environmental regulations, of oversight, and a goading on of rural farmers, ranchers, agricultural interests to essentially say the Amazon is open for business now. The Amazon is open for development. And so what I see and take it playing out and at an increasingly alarming pace is Bolsonaro in word and deed, essentially tearing down what was already a very fragile framework in place to safeguard the Amazon from logging, mining, and other commercial interests.
Many of the questions from you, the audience, actually point right in this direction. And some are asking for ideas of what responses at different levels are possible. For example, here's one from Bob. Bolsonaro is presiding over a global catastrophe in the Amazon. The U.S. has lost any moral authority and is too busy struggling with its own Bolsonaro. Where are the casques bleus? Casque bleu is French for the blue helmets, and I think refers to the UN in this case. Google produces images, but knowledge without action will not protect the indigenous peoples, the caboclos, or anyone else. What can we do?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting question. I think it points at one of the most difficult tensions that we're experiencing right now, which is that we're all in a pickle. And by we, I mean anyone who cares about oxygen and fresh water and an intact planet, in that the more we do, the more we say about the Amazon, the more that we embolden and feed into Bolsonaro's paranoid view that the world has its eyes on the Amazon and that foreign interests have the goal of essentially annexing parts of the Amazon for their own development interests. So the challenge that we're in, I'm glad that the questioner brought up our current lack of moral authority on these issues, because one of the things that I always want to stress whenever I'm talking to groups of people about dysfunction in Brazil is that all of these issues, whether we're talking about environmental issues, mass incarceration, militarization of the police, runaway development, these are all Pan-American issues. The privatization of the commons, these are things that we're very much grappling with here in the United States as well as we speak. So we have lost a great deal of moral authority. On the other hand, even those countries that have retained some of their moral authority on these issues are really struggling to be heard by the Bolsonaro administration, because that vision that we were describing earlier of his sort of dictatorship-era vision is one that is very nationalistic and very protective of the sovereignty of the Amazon rainforest. So the pickle that we're in is that as outsiders to Brazil, the more that we talk about the rainforest, the more that we are feeding into this sort of paranoid fantasy that our interest in the rainforest is not environmental protection, but extraction. And even as recently as this week, these fires that perhaps you've all heard about that are raging out of control right now in the Amazon, Bolsonaro has now baselessly accused international NGOs of starting the fires in an effort to undermine his administration. So as far as what we can do, it's really difficult to say. I think that's one of the most difficult questions to answer right now, aside from we can't, if we can't rely on the moral authority of our government right now, at very least we can rely on our agency as consumers, being aware of supply chains, and being aware of where our beef comes from, where our wood products come from, where all the products come from that are attached in some way to deforestation. But nonetheless, that's a really slow method to change when you're talking about like consumer boycotts, and we're losing 3 football fields of the Amazon per minute. So in the time we've been talking, right, we've lost the forest is burning day and night. So what can we do? I guess the short answer is like step one, like I don't mean this in a self-congratulatory way, but like you all being here to hear this tonight and to be engaged in this conversation with us, I think is an important step. Raising awareness. There's a lot to worry about in the world right now. On any way you look, there's a crisis. But this is definitely one we all ought to be keeping an eye on and raising awareness with our friends and neighbors about as well.
So if I were to go off on a limb, I could say, well, maybe blockchain will be able to be used to trace things. I mean, you make a really interesting point here about illegally logged mahogany, which then gets, quote unquote, legalized when it gets near Belém before it goes on to, hardware. And what do they call there's a, I can't remember the name of the chain here in the United States where you can, Home Depot, for example. So, yeah, that one too, yeah.
And it's almost as if, it's funny you mentioned blockchain, because not a week goes by that I don't see a story about some technology that's going to save the Amazon, whether it's blockchain or drones or cell phones or any number of GIS systems and so forth. What's troublesome is that any one of these technologies is in fact a double-edged sword, because as quickly as governments can learn how to use them, criminal enterprises can learn how to use them much more nimbly than governments can use them for good. And so just as a mobile phone may allow indigenous communities to organize and to dispatch notices to the international media when their territory is being invaded, loggers and miners can use mobile phones too, as can drug traffickers, as can corrupt police and militias and so forth. So one of the other pickles we're in this case is that all of these technologies that have so much promise in terms of helping conserve the Amazon also have great capacity for harm as well. That's not a very hopeful message, but.
There are several points in the book where you spend a lot of very productive time talking about proactive indigenous leaders, which I thought was great to read about. In fact, one of them, the Yanomami David
Kaponewa.
We actually met here in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
About 3 years ago.
Oh, wow.
I think it may have been actually at World Affairs, but yeah.
Wow.
Believe it or not, yeah. And then some of the most hopeful ones were the young indigenous person who was actually a Funai person, I think in Tabatinga. Yeah, Funai is the national, essentially. Well, go ahead and explain.
Yeah, National Indigenous Protection Agency, generally speaking. Yeah. And this young man was a manager there at the Indigenous Health Organization in the Tres Fronteiras region up near Tabatinga. And he had grown up in a relatively remote indigenous village. And now, as a manager of the Indigenous Health Agency, was working to help provide drinkable water and filtration systems for tribal communities there, and not only helping bring these filtration systems to the villages, but also equipping the men and women of the village to service and maintain and operate those machines. And so that their sense of livelihood and their sense of pride and sustainability was not coming from, support from outside, but from there in their village. And this is what astonishes me in terms of, to go back to Bolsonaro's vision, and we were speaking earlier about Paulo Guedes, one of his finance ministers and key economic and development advisor. If their vision is to genuinely help better and the quality of life and develop the Amazon, this problematic word in of itself, but if their ambition truly is to develop the Amazon, one thing they ought to realize is that Amazon is already pretty developed. There are thousands of miles of roads, dozens of some of the largest ports in the world, universities, gas pipelines, technology companies. Harley-Davidson has a factory in Manaus. They produce Fat Boy motorcycles. I don't know if any of you ever rode one of those, but they sound very loud. But they sound as loud as you might imagine. But there's a enormous economic potential in the Amazon that has already been sort of halfway realized. So it's not as if the Amazon hasn't been developed. It's just been developed and managed very poorly. That's not a message that sits well in Brazil, because as you know as well as anyone, they don't particularly like to be told that they've mismanaged a great portion of their territory and to the detriment of 10% of their population. But I would wonder what would a truly sustainable vision for development of the Amazon look like if Bolsonaro and Guedes or whoever else was at the top were truly invested in the human potential of the 30 million people who are living there. Because it doesn't look like more roads, and it doesn't look like an unbridled land grab. I think what it probably looks like is fixing some of the existing infrastructure in cities and towns where 80 or 90% of the people don't have running water right now. I mean, if we're wanting to put people to work, if we want to use bulldozers and heavy machinery, okay, but let's put it to use where it's actually going to help people.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because a friend of mine from southern Brazil just sent me a transcript of a TV show where it was, it was about concerns of NGOs in the Amazon. And in fact, they end up on the TV show flying over part of the Rio Negro, the northern parts of Brazil, and talking about NGOs that they meet on the ground with young kids, asking, what are you doing here? Why are you doing it? And then going and talking to the local military commander, going and talking to other people, saying what's going on, and a lot of shoulder shrugging, essentially. A lot of it didn't seem it seemed like a tempest in a teapot, but clearly this type of reporting is designed and used by the TV people to spark that same knee jerk that you were mentioning earlier. Now, the other component that comes in here is particularly the evangelical, and you spend some time in your book talking about two different groups of American evangelists who are active in the Amazon.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned NGOs being demonized as sort of being, I mean, NGOs among the far right and right in Brazil right now is kind of being used as like a shorthand for like communists, right? If you're talking about NGOs, you're talking about Marxists who are infiltrating Brazil. But likewise, the other group that's been demonized is the Catholic Church, which is knows about as much as anyone about exploitation in South America, but that even the Catholic Church has come around to the idea that indigenous rights ought to be preserved and protected in the Amazon. And if the Catholic Church is on board with that message, then it's not as if this is a radical idea. So the evangelicals, in the meantime, have absolutely been ascendant in Brazil over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And so it's interesting to me to note that as this sort of far-right evangelical Christianity has risen in Brazil, so has a very aggressive pro-gun lobby in Brazil. And as NGOs and international groups have been sort of demonized as Marxist, leftist infiltrators, so has even the Catholic Church been accused of trying to like manage Brazilian affairs from afar. And I'm curious, so you having been there in the 60s and 70s, that was when liberation theology and the Catholic Church were very much ascendant in the Amazon at the time, right?
I was just thinking about how important the Catholic Church was to just sort of the mainstay of culture in the little towns. Tefe, for example, had Dutch priests. What is it? Manakaparu, which is close to Manaus, had American priests. There was one other city we went to, I think it was Quari, had Italian priests. And so you had this interesting connection of Catholic priests living long-term in the Amazon, none of whom were Brazilian. And so in some respects, despite all of this, Amazon is ours, the mainstay of religion and culture has been in those areas, the Catholic Church, for years. Yeah. Here's another one. Can you talk about the political orientation and aspirations of locals in the Amazon? What is their range of hopes? Now, this goes back to what is sustainable. Wondering about what perspectives we are missing about what they would like to see as a future.
Yeah, that's a really great question. One thing that I would like to point out in terms of local politics in the Amazon is that if there is a ray of hope in all this right now, as much destruction as we may be seeing daily and weekly on the news in the Amazon, it's that indigenous communities are organized and mobilized like never before in the Amazon. So when we were beginning to see this initial wave of rampant runaway deforestation in the Amazon in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, indigenous communities had the support and help of the Catholic Church and liberation theologists who were very much sort of helping them begin to get organized. But nowadays, indigenous communities are very tightly coordinated and have, working in their favor, coalitions that work locally, regionally, across the country to sort of help them advance their interests in unison in ways that were not possible even 10 years ago. So I think that's a ray of hope. In terms of the average everyday citizen in, say, Manaus, I think, or Belém, or any of the more urban areas in the Amazon, I think the local politics, the local political scene is largely one of deep frustration, deep economic frustration in terms of the fact that they've been in this protracted recession going on 5 years now of very low unemployment. Likewise, a sense of just
High
deep frustration.
you mean.
Or excuse me, yeah. Thank you. High unemployment. And low wage growth, that's what I was getting at there. And coupled with the sense of deep frustration with corruption in their government at every level, local, state, and federal, which was largely one of the reasons why Bolsonaro was able to ascend so rapidly, was he was able to tap into this vein of deep frustration. Unfortunately, that corruption investigation has proven to be corrupt in and of itself, which complicates matters and only deepens that sense of frustration. But one thing that I've, in my travels, talking with a lot of younger Brazilians in their 20s and 30s, one sense that I've gotten is a desire for when is the next generation of leadership going to come? Who is going to come up and sort of lead from the current generation and not leading with the ideologies of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And unfortunately, one of the side effects of Bolsonaro's rampant anti-LGBTQ rhetoric is that some of the most diverse and progressive politicians in the country are leaving or thinking of leaving or feeling threats to their lives. So I think I would characterize the local timber of politics as being one of frustration and fear, and a lot of buyer's remorse, even among those more like centrist Bolsonaro voters who are now looking back less than a year later, being like, oh, geez, maybe I put my vote in the wrong hat. But we still have a long way to go before the next election, unfortunately, for a lot of Brazilians.
Thank you. Yeah. Another one of our people in the audience has really perhaps a ray of hope, something that I didn't know. In the trade agreement that Mercosur, which is an agreement between Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, I believe, that those countries. And the European Union just completed negotiating. Brazil is required to prevent further destruction of the Amazon rainforest. France has already said it won't ratify if rainforest is not protected. Will this help? That's interesting.
So, in the worldview of Bolsonaro and his administration, things like international trade agreements, things like the United Nations are all a bunch of Marxist mumbo jumbo. And so I don't place a lot of faith in Bolsonaro and his administration going forward with these sorts of trade agreements with any fidelity. On the flip side, if I were to focus on any of the many trade conflicts happening around the globe right now, I think one of the most undercovered trade conflicts that's having an enormous effect on the Amazon is actually our own president's trade conflict with China, insofar as right now, China has a voracious appetite for beef, for soy, that's not coming from the United States right now. And where it is coming from is Brazil. So one of the reasons why you're seeing this enormous rush and land grab for new agricultural territory in the Amazon and elsewhere in Brazil is to sort of feed this newfound appetite and this newly ascendant market in China. So I do think that there is hope, to go back to the questioner's comment, there is hope that international pressure through these trade agreements can help maintain or at least restore some sense of equilibrium in terms of conservation and development and investment interests. However, I think that there's a lot of moving pieces globally in that regard, none of which seem to have an easy solution at this point. Although it is encouraging to know that even among the agricultural lobby in Brazil, even among the most relentlessly capitalistic rural lobby, there are people who are expressing concern that if we go too far in this direction, we're going to hurt the image of Brazilian agribusiness abroad. So there's even been some caution flags thrown up among the ruralistas, which in and of itself is alarming. When Bolsonaro is moving so quickly that even his own ruralista fans are expressing caution.
That's interesting, yeah. We've talked a bit about the impact of technology and how it's a really interesting question. I wonder if you can talk a bit about the role of YouTube in Brazil. The New York Times just ran an article about its prevalence. Mm-hmm. Did you happen to see this, and what can you tell us about YouTube? I would think all other sorts of social media, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Brazil is a place where no one uses anything but WhatsApp. As far as I can tell.
WhatsApp is enormously popular there. I believe Brazil is YouTube's second largest market. And what I can say so I was in Belo Horizonte last fall during the second round election and the weeks leading up to and on election night. And what I saw was not actually all that dissimilar from what we see here during some of our election cycles, which is just an enormous spread and rapid spread of misinformation. And what was a little bit jarring was that not only was the misinformation spread among the right, it was also these memes, these videos, these graphics, which had clearly been doctored to sort of stoke the fans of division, or fan the flames of division. These were being shared just as widely and just as rapidly among the left because they were sharing them in just sheer disbelief. Like, can this be real? Are you seeing this? So even people in the opposition to Bolsonaro were sort of feeding the viral nature of these posts, these videos, and so forth. I think that one of the things that's beginning to come out, that you mentioned that article about YouTube and its role, WhatsApp played a huge role, and there's an ongoing investigation into some large blocks of WhatsApp ads that were purchased perhaps illicitly by supporters of Bolsonaro. So in every bit as much as social media and YouTube and so forth has been sort of weaponized against American democracy, it's happening in Brazil as well. And Brazil is a country, they love the internet. They love social media. And so it is, it's scary to see how quickly it spreads. And that's something I don't see getting better anytime soon, here or there, really, because it seems like whenever one platform sort of takes some steps to correct course, another platform sort of fills fills the misinformation void.